I knew I was in for another storm the second I saw Karren Dellinger stomping across my lawn in her orthopedic sandals, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. She was the president of our HOA, self-appointed, naturally, and if there was a shred of peace in the neighborhood, she'd find a way to vacuum it out. I was raking the last of the golden maple leaves off my front yard when she stopped at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed like she owned the whole street. "Franklin Walters," she barked, mispronouncing my last name for the 10th year in a row, "your lawn is becoming a seasonal hazard. HOA code says all visible debris must be cleared within 48 hours of tree shedding." I leaned on my rake. "That tree's on HOA property, Karren, and I cleaned it yesterday." She narrowed her eyes. "We'll see what the board says." I didn't respond. I'd learned not to feed the troll. The next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee and nearly dropped the mug. My entire front yard, every inch, was buried under a thick, wet mountain of leaves. Not just leaves, either. Twigs, pine cones, even a few fast food wrappers. The smell was aggressive. I checked my security footage. Sure enough, at 3 a.m, a landscaping crew wearing HOA vests rolled up with leaf blowers and dumped everything from the common park area right onto my property. I walked back inside, called out to my daughter, Elise, to grab her coat, then headed to the barn out back. "See, I'm not just some guy with a lawn. I run a small landscaping business on the side, which Karren hates because it brings down the residential aesthetic. Whatever that means." What really bothered her was that I did better work than the overpriced crew she hired for the HOA. I fired up my old John Deere tractor, attached the front loader, and started scooping the leaf pile back into the trailer. Elise followed along in her bike helmet, giggling like it was a field trip. By noon, the trailer was packed to the brim. I drove it straight down the road, past Karren's house, to the community pool. The same pool the HOA had just spent 20 grand resurfacing. The same pool Karren spent every weekend bragging about at board meetings. Without a second thought, I dumped the entire load of leaves right over the pool gate and shoveled the rest in for good measure. It was a leafy, brown, soggy mess. Elise clapped like it was a parade float. Half the neighborhood came out to watch. No one said a word, but I saw the smirks. Real ones. 10 minutes later, Karren came screeching down the road like a vulture in a minivan. She slammed on the brakes in front of the pool and leapt out, her face redder than a stop sign. "You've lost your mind, Franklin." I climbed down from the tractor. "No, Karren. I just returned your property." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. Then she turned on her heel and stormed off, already dialing someone on her phone. I knew what was coming next. Good. Let her try. By the time I finished rinsing the mud off the trailer, the first letter was already taped to my front door, delivered by hand, not mail. That alone told me they were skipping procedure. No envelope, just a single printed sheet with the HOA header and that ridiculous eagle logo they insisted made them look official. The letter had exactly 3 sentences. "Due to your reckless act of vandalism and illegal dumping, the HOA board is issuing a fine in the amount of $5,000. Immediate payment is expected within 10 business days. Failure to comply will result in legal escalation and potential lien placement." I didn't laugh, but I did take a photo and forwarded it to a friend of mine, Maya, a municipal code officer who owed me a favor from the time I helped her brother rebuild his deck for half price. She called me back before I even got inside. "That's not enforceable," she said without pleasantries. "They're not a government agency. They can't issue fines like that without a hearing, and even then, not for something that didn't violate actual bylaws." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "So what are my options?" "Start a complaint file, document everything, and Franklin." Her tone shifted. "If they're retaliating, you need to be ready for more than just paper threats." She wasn't wrong. That night, my motion sensor lights triggered at 2:15 a.m. I checked the camera feed on my phone. A man in a reflective vest was standing beside my truck, holding something close to the gas cap. I pulled on jeans and boots, grabbed the bat from behind the door and stepped out into the cold. He was gone by the time I got there, but the gas cap was open, and the smell of bleach hit me before I even bent down. I filed a police report the next morning. The responding officer took one look at the footage and frowned. "This isn't teenage mischief," he said. "This was planned." He took statements, copies of the video, and promised to follow up. I didn't expect much. Small-town PD didn't exactly drop everything for HOA disputes, but the fact that I'd filed a report created a paper trail, and that mattered more than anything right now. 2 days later, Elise came home from school upset. She'd been pulled aside by a teacher who said the principal had received a concerned letter from the HOA, warning that I was creating an unsafe environment and that child welfare authorities may need to be involved. That's when things turned. I drove directly to the school and asked to speak with the principal. He came out looking nervous, holding a manila folder with the HOA letter signed by Karren herself. "This is out of line," he admitted, scanning the text again. "But when we get something like this, we're obligated to take it seriously until it's resolved." I kept my voice steady. "I have video evidence of HOA members trespassing, tampering with my property, and now they're targeting my daughter. I've already involved the police." His eyes widened. "Would you be willing to provide the footage?" "Absolutely." Back home, I compiled everything: security clips, timestamps, the forged fine letter, and now this attempt to interfere with my daughter's schooling. I sent it all to Maya and CC'd a lawyer I'd worked with once before, a retired civil litigator named Harold Monroe. He was the kind of guy who wore suspenders unironically and could quote zoning law like scripture. Harold called me later that evening. "Well, Franklin," he said with a slow drawl, "I've seen some HOA nonsense in my day, but this one's got teeth. And unfortunately for them, they just bit into a legal hornet's nest." He offered to represent me pro bono for the first filing. "I've been itching to take one of these overreaching boards to court. Let's start with a cease and desist. Then we'll file for injunctive relief. If they want to escalate, we'll bury them in depositions." That Friday, I served Karren the paperwork myself. She was pruning her hedges with hedge clippers that looked more ornamental than functional and didn't hear me walk up. "A little early for topiary work, isn't it?" I said, holding out the envelope. She turned, startled, and immediately scowled. "You can't come onto my property. This is a legal service of documents," I interrupted. "You're officially notified of a cease and desist for harassment, property tampering, and defamation. You'll also find a restraining order request since you involved my child." Her face paled, but she said nothing. I turned and walked away, not waiting for a response. The next week, the board held an emergency meeting closed to the public, of course. But I'd already learned from Harold that any HOA meeting involving finances or disciplinary action must be open to members. I showed up with a lawn chair and a portable speaker, set up just 10 feet from the clubhouse door. I hit play. The speaker blasted audio from the night of the leaf dump. My security cam had picked up the crew talking, clearly saying, "Karren said dump it all. She wants to make an example." Half the neighborhood had gathered by then, curious about the show. When the doors finally opened, Karren looked like she'd aged 5 years in 5 days. She stood on the clubhouse step and tried to address the crowd. "Let's not let one disgruntled member derail the board's efforts to maintain order," I cut her off. "You mean the order that includes bleach in gas tanks and anonymous letters to schools?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "You did what?" Another added, "Is that why the pool's still closed?" The mood shifted. Not in my favor against her, I didn't need to say anything else. People started asking for transparency, for access to the HOA budget, for a vote to remove board members, and that's when I knew I had her, not with noise. Not with revenge, with receipts. By Monday, 3 board members had resigned. Karren tried to hold on, but a petition circulated faster than wildfire. Over 70% of the homeowners signed. That was all we needed. The following week, we held a recall vote in the community center. Elise even helped hand out ballots, proudly wearing a neon vest labeled Honorary Volunteer. When the results were read, Karren had been removed by a landslide. I stood at the back, arms crossed, watching her pack up her binder and storm out of the room without a word. She didn't even look at me. She didn't have to. A week after the recall vote, the neighborhood was quieter than it had been in months. Not peaceful, exactly more like the silence you get after a storm levels a building. People were still cautious, still watching to see if the dust would settle or if more would come crashing down. I wasn't waiting. I was digging. See, while Karren had been busy playing dictator, she'd kept the board deliberately opaque. But with 3 members stepping down and the 4th too nervous to show her face at the clubhouse, I was able to convince the interim president, an older guy named Greg, who used to work in city planning, to give me access to past budget records. He handed me a dusty box with a simple warning. Just know what you're getting into before you open it. I spent the next 3 nights at my kitchen table, sorting receipts, invoices, and meeting notes that were supposed to be filed quarterly. What I found wasn't just mismanagement, it was fraud, real, prosecutable fraud. Invoices from landscaping crews that didn't exist, payments for pool repairs that were never done. A full year's worth of maintenance fees paid out to a company registered under the name Dellinger Residential Services LLC with a P.O. box in the next county over. Karren had been funneling HOA funds into a shell account. Quiet, consistent skimming that added up to over $70,000 in 3 years. And the joke, she'd been so arrogant she didn't even bother hiding the paper trail. Her name was on the registration, bold as brass. I called Harold that night, and he showed up the next morning with a rolling briefcase and a thermos of black coffee. "She made it easy," he said, flipping through the files. "This isn't just grounds for a civil suit, this is grand theft and wire fraud." "We're talking years in prison. Can we prove intent?" I asked. He tapped the records. "The check stubs are made out to her own LLC, that's intent gift wrapped with a bow, and if we get a forensic accountant to testify, it's over." By noon, we'd reported everything to the county sheriff's office. A detective named Ruiz was assigned to the case, and he didn't waste time. He came by that afternoon, wearing a plain blue jacket and a badge clipped to his belt. He asked to see everything, and I handed it over. As he flipped through the evidence, he whistled under his breath. "You know," he said, "we've had complaints about that HOA for years, but no one's ever had this much proof." "Then let's make it count," I told him. He nodded. "We will. I'll need to interview some board members, and I'm going to need you to not mention this to anyone else for now." "Especially not her," I agreed. But I didn't need to say anything because by the following Tuesday, Karren made it impossible to stay quiet. It started with a flyer. A glossy, double-sided mailer sent to every house in the neighborhood. On one side, a letter from Karren claiming she was being unjustly targeted by a smear campaign. On the other, a call for concerned citizens to demand her reinstatement to the board. She was trying to stage a comeback. But she didn't know the sheriff's office had already issued a subpoena for her bank records. The next day, Ruiz called me. "She's lawyering up. Her attorney reached out this morning." Does that mean she knows? She knows she's in trouble. But I don't think she realizes how deep it goes. That same afternoon, Greg called an open neighborhood forum at the basketball court behind the clubhouse. It was the only space big enough to hold everyone, and nearly every resident showed up. People brought folding chairs, snacks, even a projector. I brought the truth. Greg stood up front and introduced me. "Franklin has some information that affects every homeowner here. We've all got a right to hear it." I took the mic and kept it simple. For the past 3 years, our dues have been used to line the pockets of one person. I've turned over the documents to law enforcement, but you deserve to see it too. I clicked the remote. The projector lit up the wall with scanned invoices, bank transfers, and finally a screenshot of the LLC registration with Karren's name listed as the owner. Gasps broke out. Someone dropped a soda can. A woman near the front clutched her husband's arm like she'd been punched. Then someone shouted, "She stole from all of us," I nodded. Every tree that didn't get trimmed, every sidewalk crack that went ignored, every broken light in the parking lot that money was supposed to cover it. And now, it's gone. A voice from the back called, "How much?" "Over 70,000. That was the tipping point, not the fraud. Not even the gaslighting, the money. The next morning, Karren's house had a sheriff's cruiser parked outside. Ruiz texted me later to confirm she'd been taken in for questioning. No cuffs yet, just an initial detainment, but it was coming. Later that week, Elise and I were walking past the rec center when we saw a small moving truck parked in Karren's driveway. Her nephew, one of the few family members who hadn't cut ties, was hauling boxes to the curb. He didn't look at us. He didn't need to. The whole neighborhood had already seen the arrest report in the local paper. But what stuck with me wasn't the takedown. It was what came after. People started showing up at my door, not just to thank me, but to ask how they could help fix things. Greg offered to restructure the board with rotating leadership. Local business owners volunteered to audit the books. Even the Johnsons, the couple who used to keep to themselves, suggested organizing a neighborhood cleanup to reclaim the common areas that had been neglected for so long. And me. I didn't want a title, I didn't want power, but I did agree to one thing. We installed a big wooden message board by the clubhouse. Not digital, not fancy. Just a board with pushpins, laminated bylaws, and a weekly update schedule. Elise painted the header herself in green and gold, our voice. Our vote. The pool was still closed, buried under soggy leaf mulch and reeking of stagnant water, but we left it that way for a reason. Every time someone asked when it would be cleaned up, someone else would answer, "When we've finished cleaning up everything else." It became a symbol. A reminder of what happens when one person thinks they own everyone else, and what happens when we finally say no. The pool remained untouched for weeks, not because we couldn't clean it up, but because nobody wanted to. It stood as a monument to what we'd all allowed to simmer under our noses. But with Karren gone and the board dismantled, people were finally willing to step into the mess, both literal and figurative. Greg, now acting as interim president until the next election, called a town hall meeting on the basketball court. This time, it wasn't about confrontation. It was about rebuilding. I didn't bring any presentations or evidence, just a folding chair and a notepad like everyone else. "I'm not here to lead," Greg said, standing on a milk crate someone had brought from their garage. "I'm here to hand leadership back to the community." No more closed-door meetings, no more unchecked authority. We decide how this neighborhood runs. There were nods across the crowd, a few cautious ones, a few hopeful. Then a woman I'd never spoken to before, Sandra, the retired nurse from the cul-de-sac, raised her hand. "What happens to the money we lost? The dues she took?" Greg looked at me. I stood. "The county's building a case," I said. "Her accounts are frozen. If they convict, restitution will be part of the sentencing, but that could take time. Meanwhile, we can stop the bleeding. No more payments until we establish a new board with oversight." A man near the back, Jorge, who ran a food truck, asked, "Can we even do that legally?" A voice answered before I could. Harold had arrived unnoticed, walking quietly up the side with his briefcase slung over his shoulder. "Absolutely," he said, stepping forward. "The HOA bylaws allow for a full reformation if the board is dissolved and a quorum of homeowners votes in favor. I've drafted the paperwork already." There was no debate, just a sea of hands going up. What followed over the next few days wasn't glamorous. It was spreadsheets, volunteer sign-ups, and long hours of sorting through what Karren had left behind: half-finished maintenance requests, inflated vendor contracts, and dozens of emails from residents that had never been answered. I saw one from a disabled vet asking for a ramp installation approval. It had been marked unread for over a year. That one hit harder than the rest. I tracked him down 2 doors over from the park. His name was Dennis, and he answered the door in a motorized chair with duct tape covering the left armrest. "I'm not looking for charity," he said before I could even introduce myself. "You're not getting charity," I replied. "You're getting what you were entitled to the day you moved in." With Jorge's help, we installed the ramp that weekend. No red tape, no forms. Just lumber, screws, and a borrowed power drill. By the end of the month, the new board was elected. Not one of them had ever served before. No one wore matching polos or talked about aesthetic consistency. They were teachers, mechanics, a librarian, and even a teenager who ran the community bulletin on social media. It felt right. But just when things began to settle, a letter arrived at my address. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from the district attorney's office. The charges against Karren had grown. What started as wire fraud and theft had expanded to include falsification of corporate records, obstruction of law enforcement, and conspiracy. During the investigation, they'd uncovered that she'd forged minutes from meetings that never occurred and backdated approvals for budget expenses that had never been voted on. She'd even forged a signature from a board member who died 2 years ago. The DA wanted a witness impact statement. Not just about the money, but about the damage to the community. I wasn't sure how to write it at first. I didn't want to turn it into a personal vendetta. But then Elise came into the room, holding a flyer for the neighborhood movie night she'd helped organize. It had our new board's names on the bottom and hers too, under Youth Committee. That was my answer. I wrote about trust, about how it had been eroded, then rebuilt. I wrote about the people who'd stopped believing their voices mattered and how close we'd come to letting someone rule unchecked. I didn't use big words or legal jargon, just the truth. At the sentencing hearing, I wasn't the only one who spoke. Dennis wheeled up to the microphone and talked about being ignored. Sandra gave a quiet, steady statement about fear of retaliation. Even Greg read part of the HOA charter aloud, dryly noting how many clauses Karren had violated. Karren sat in a gray suit that didn't fit and stared straight ahead. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was calm but final. "You used your position to exploit your neighbors, to enrich yourself, and to silence dissent. This court sentences you to 7 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 4. You are also ordered to pay full restitution plus fines." She didn't speak. Not a word. Outside the courthouse, no one cheered. No one gloated. It wasn't that kind of ending. Later that week, we held our first official neighborhood barbecue in the common park. The pool was still off limits, but someone had dragged out an inflatable one for the kids. Elise ran through the sprinklers with a group of them, laughing without a care in the world. Greg handed me a burger and sat down beside me on the picnic bench. "You ever think it'd end like this?" he asked. "Not once." He looked out at the crowd. "You did good, Franklin." "I didn't do it alone," he chuckled. "No, but you reminded us we could." Just before sunset, Elise tugged on my arm and pointed toward the pool gate. The leaf sludge had finally dried out and cracked. Someone had painted a mural on the concrete wall beside it. It showed a tractor rolling through a pile of leaves with the words, "We clean our own messes," in bold green paint. I didn't ask who did it. I didn't need to. The pool eventually got cleaned. The common areas were repaired, but more importantly, the people changed. Not into something new, but into something they'd forgotten they already were: neighbors, real ones. And every now and then, someone would walk past my driveway and say, "I still can't believe you used a tractor." I'd just nod and tell them the truth. Sometimes, it's the only way to get through the pile.